Welcome back to The Things That Bother Me. On this channel, we look at the things that shaped our lives, the systems we were told to believe in, and what actually happened when those systems met reality. Right now, we're in the middle of a series about Generation X called We Were Told We Could Be Anything. In the first episodes, we talked about the promise we grew up hearing, and the childhood that shaped the Gen X generation. But eventually, childhood ends. And sooner or later, every generation has to step into the real world. In this episode, we're going to talk about what happened when Generation X entered adulthood and started climbing the ladder they had been told was waiting. Because for many people, that ladder didn't look the way they expected. This is episode 3, The Ladder Disappears. When the promise meets the real world. In the first 2 episodes of this series, we looked at the world Generation X grew up in. A generation raised on a powerful promise. You can be anything. Teachers said it. Parents believed it. The culture repeated it everywhere. Work hard. Get an education. Follow the rules. And the future would open up. But before Generation X ever reached adulthood, something else shaped them first. Their childhood. Millions of Gen X kids grew up as latchkey children. Coming home to empty houses. Cooking their own meals. Watching younger siblings. Learning independence long before adulthood arrived. They didn't know it at the time, but those early lessons would become important. Because when Generation X finally stepped into the adult world, the system they had been prepared for was already beginning to change. The ladder that had built the American middle class was shifting. Factories were closing. Corporate culture was transforming. Stable careers were becoming less predictable. The rules that earlier generations had relied on were no longer working the same way. For the first time, the promise and the reality were starting to pull in different directions. This is where Generation X begins to encounter the real test of that promise. Not in childhood, but in adulthood. This is the moment when the ladder they were told to climb begins to disappear. 1. The ladder that built the middle class. To understand what Generation X encountered, you have to understand the system that existed before them. For much of the mid-20th century, the American economy offered a relatively stable path into the middle class. Manufacturing jobs were widely available. Union protections helped secure wages and benefits. Workers often received healthcare, pensions, and long-term employment. A high school diploma could open doors. A person could graduate, find a job, and begin building a stable life within a few years. This system created a powerful expectation. Hard work produced results. Effort led to upward mobility. That belief shaped how parents prepared their children for adulthood. Generation X grew up inside that belief. 2. The quiet economic shift. But by the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the economy was already changing. Manufacturing industries began relocating overseas. Automation reduced the need for certain types of labor. Corporations started reorganizing to compete in a global marketplace. Factories that had operated for decades suddenly shut down. Entire communities felt the impact. At first, these changes seemed isolated. One plant closing in one town. Another industry shrinking somewhere else. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The economy was restructuring itself. And that restructuring would reshape the ladder of opportunity. 3. The first Gen X workers enter the system. When the oldest members of Generation X began entering the workforce in the 1980s, they stepped into a system that was already shifting. Some of the old opportunities still existed. Manufacturing jobs had not completely disappeared. Long-term careers were still possible in certain industries. But the competition for those jobs was growing. Openings were fewer. Advancement was slower. Young workers began noticing that the climb upward required more effort than it had for previous generations. The ladder still stood. but fewer people were able to climb it the same way. 4. Corporate culture changes. During this same period, corporate culture itself began evolving. Earlier generations often worked for the same company for most of their careers. Employers invested in long-term relationships with employees. Promotions came with time and experience. But by the 1980s and 1990s, companies increasingly focused on efficiency, restructuring, and shareholder returns. Layoffs became more common. Departments were reorganized. Entire divisions were sometimes eliminated. The idea of lifetime employment began fading. Workers discovered that loyalty was no longer a guarantee of stability. 5. The rise of job instability. As companies changed their priorities, the nature of work changed as well. Temporary jobs became more common. Contract work increased. Workers moved between employers more frequently. For many Gen X adults, careers no longer followed a straight upward path. Instead of climbing a single ladder, people found themselves navigating a series of shorter ladders. Some led upward. Some led sideways. Some ended unexpectedly. The predictability that earlier generations had relied on began disappearing. 6. Education becomes the new promise. As traditional job paths weakened, schools began emphasizing a new message. Education would be the solution. If the economy was becoming more complex, college degrees would open doors. Guidance counselors encouraged students to pursue higher education. Parents urged their children to earn diplomas. College was presented as the new ladder. The promise remained familiar. Work hard. Earn your degree. And opportunity would follow. For many Gen X students, that promise felt like the natural next step. 7. The rising cost of opportunity. But as college enrollment increased, so did the cost of education. Tuition climbed steadily throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Student loans became more common. For the first time, large numbers of young adults began starting their careers already carrying significant debt. Education was still framed as an investment in the future. But the risk attached to that investment was growing. Opportunity was no longer free. 8. Older Gen X versus younger Gen X. Even within Generation X, the timing of adulthood created different experiences. The older members of Gen X, born in the late 1960s and early 1970s, entered the workforce while parts of the old system still existed. Some manufacturing jobs were still available. Certain companies still offered long-term careers. The latter was already weakening, but it had not yet fully transformed. The younger Gen X group, often referred to as Zennials, entered adulthood closer to the late 1990s and early 2000s. By that time, the transformation had accelerated. Technology was reshaping industries. The internet economy was emerging. Corporate restructuring had become normal. For this younger group, the latter looked different from the beginning. Both halves of Generation X encountered the same reality. But they stepped into it at different stages of the transition. The parents that raised Generation X. Another difference inside Generation X came from who raised them. Some Gen X children were raised by silent generation parents. Others were raised by baby boomers. Those two groups had very different experiences with the economy. Silent generation parents had often lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the early post-war economy. Many of them believed strongly in stability, discipline, and steady work. They had often climbed the traditional ladder themselves, so when they told their children that hard work would pay off, they were speaking from experience. Many younger Gen X children, however, were raised by boomer parents. Boomers had grown up during a period of rapid expansion and opportunity. College attendance increased, suburban life expanded, and the American economy appeared strong and upward moving. So the message many Gen X kids heard was simple. Work hard. Get an education. You'll succeed. But the economy that Gen X entered was already beginning to change. The expectations being passed down were based on a system that no longer worked the same way. The minimum wage reality. For some members of Generation X, the ladder didn't just become harder to climb. It seemed to disappear entirely. Many workers entered the job market during periods when wages stagnated while costs rose. Some Gen X adults found themselves stuck in low-wage work much longer than anyone expected. Minimum wage jobs that were once considered temporary stepping stones sometimes became a long-term reality that lasted their lifetime. Minimum wage for life. For a generation raised to believe opportunity was everywhere, this experience was confusing and frustrating. They had followed the instructions they were given. But the system they entered was no longer producing the outcomes they had been promised. 9. Delayed stability. As these economic shifts unfolded, traditional milestones became harder to reach. Home ownership often came later. Career stability required more time. Financial security took longer to build. The timeline of adulthood stretched. Generation X was working harder and longer to reach the same destinations earlier generations had reached sooner. The ladder still existed. But the climb required more years of effort. 10. Adaptation. Faced with these challenges, Generation X adapted. They changed careers, developed new skills, entered emerging industries. Some started businesses. Others built unconventional career paths that didn't resemble the traditional ladder at all. The independence they had developed during childhood helped them navigate uncertainty. The generation that had learned to take care of itself as latchkey kids applied that same mindset to adulthood. They adjust. They kept climbing. Even when the structure beneath them kept shifting. In closing, the ladder that changed. Generation X grew up hearing the same promise over and over again. Work hard. Follow the rules. Climb the ladder. The system would reward effort. For earlier generations, that ladder had often been real. Factories hired young workers. Union jobs paid solid wages. Companies trained employees and kept them for decades. A person could start at the bottom and slowly build a stable life. That was the system many parents had known. Some Gen X children were raised by silent generation parents who had lived through hard times and believed deeply in discipline, steady work, and long-term stability. Others were raised by baby boomers who had grown up during a time when opportunity seemed to expand in every direction. Both groups passed down the same belief. Work hard and the future will open up. But by the time Generation X stepped into adulthood, the system behind that promise had already begun to shift. Factories were disappearing. Corporations were restructuring. Stable careers were becoming harder to find. The ladder still existed, but it no longer worked the same way. And even within Generation X, the experience wasn't identical. The older members of Gen X entered a workforce where pieces of the old system still remained. Manufacturing jobs had not yet fully disappeared. Some companies still offered long-term careers. The ladder was weakening, but parts of it were still standing. The younger Gen X group, sometimes called Zennials, entered adulthood later, when the transformation had already moved further along. Technology was reshaping industries. Corporate restructuring had become normal. Job stability was harder to find from the very beginning. For them, the ladder looked different the moment they stepped onto it. And for some members of Generation X, the ladder didn't just become harder to climb. It seemed to stop altogether. Wages stagnated. Costs kept rising. Jobs that were once stepping stones sometimes became permanent. Many workers found themselves stuck in low-wage work far longer than anyone had expected. The instructions they had followed didn't produce the outcome they had been promised. Still, Generation X did what they had learned to do since childhood. They adapted. The latchkey generation had grown up solving problems on their own. Cooking their own meals. Watching their siblings. figuring things out when no one else was around. When the latter began changing, they applied that same independence to adulthood. They changed jobs, learned new skills, started businesses, moved across industries. They kept climbing, even when the structure beneath them kept shifting. But the economic changes they faced were only part of the story. Because as time moved forward, Generation X would find itself carrying another burden. Children to raise. Parents growing older. Responsibilities coming from both directions. The generation that had grown up unlocking their own doors was about to find itself standing in the middle. Supporting the future, while holding up the past. And that pressure would define the next chapter of their story. Next episode. The College Gamble. So this was the moment when many in Generation X began to realize something important. The system we had been prepared for wasn't the system we were stepping into. The ladder that earlier generations had climbed was still there in pieces, but the climb had changed. Some rungs were missing. Some had moved. And for many people, the path upward became far less predictable than anyone had expected. Still, Generation X did what it had learned to do since childhood. It adapted. But as the old ladder weakened, a new promise started replacing it. If you wanted stability, if you wanted opportunity, there was a new path everyone began pointing toward. College. The idea was simple. Get a degree, and the doors would open. But for many in Generation X, that path would turn out to be far more complicated than anyone expected. Next episode, The College Gamble. If this episode made you think, or if parts of it sound familiar to your own experience growing up Gen X, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy digging into the things people notice but don't always talk about, make sure to like, share, and subscribe below. This is the things that bother me. Until next time.